Late November 1944. Fronhoven, Germany. The cold had settled into everything, the mud, the metal, the men. A Sherman tank sat motionless in the grey afternoon light, its engine silent, disabled by an American mine that had torn through its track. The crew had abandoned it hours ago, scrambling through rifle fire to reach friendly lines. Now the tank was alone, a steel monument to bad luck in a landscape already crowded with them. But this wasn't an ordinary Sherman. From 800 yards away, hidden in the skeletal remains of a farmhouse near Lone, a German anti-tank crew prepared their 88mm gun. They'd been waiting. An immobilized American tank was a gift, a chance to destroy enemy equipment before it could be recovered. The gunner sighted carefully through the optic, centering the crosshairs on the tank's glacis plate. The commander gave the order. The gun roared. The shell struck the front armor with a sound like a church bell hit by a leak. Sledgehammer. Smoke and dust obscured the target. When it cleared, the tank sat unchanged. No penetration, no fire. The German crew stared in disbelief. They'd just hit a Sherman at point-blank range with the most feared anti-tank gun of the war, and the tank had shrugged it off like rainwater. They loaded another round. This one struck the gun mantlet, the massive shield protecting the turret front. It ricocheted skyward, screaming into the distance. A third round hit the glacis again, another bounce. The German commander's frustration turned to something closer to fear. What kind of Sherman was this? By the time they fired their 8th shot, 8 rounds from an 88mm gun that could punch through nearly any Allied tank at twice that distance, only one had penetrated, slipping through the side sponson to ignite the fuel and ammunition inside. The tank burned, but 7 of 8 shells had failed to breach armor that, according to everything the Germans knew about, American tanks shouldn't have existed. The crew who'd abandoned that M4A3E2, the tank the Americans were calling the Jumbo, didn't know they'd just proven something extraordinary. They didn't know that their tank's survival, even in death, would become evidence in one of the war's strangest engineering stories. A story about a promise America had made to its soldiers, a promise to stop the unstoppable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The promise began with a lie. Or maybe it was just hope dressed up as doctrine. In 1942, when the first Sherman tanks rolled off production lines in Detroit and Grand Blanc, American tank doctrine rested on a comforting theory. Medium tanks weren't meant to fight other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers fast, lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns designed specifically for killing armor. Sherman tanks would support infantry, destroy fortifications, exploit breakthroughs. Tank versus tank combat would be rare, and when it happened, American numerical superiority and superior crew training would win the day. It was a doctrine written by men who'd never faced an 88. The German 88mm gun had started life as an anti-aircraft weapon, designed to knock bombers from 30,000 feet. But in the desert fighting of North Africa, German crews discovered that when you pointed a gun capable of reaching the stratosphere horizontally at a tank, the results were catastrophic. The high-velocity 88mm shell traveling at 2,800 feet per second, carrying the kinetic energy of a small car crash in a package the size of a wine bottle, didn't just penetrate armor, it obliterated it. Against a standard M4 Sherman, with its 51mm of frontal armor sloped at 56 degrees, the 88 was surgical. At 1,000 yards, it could punch through the glacis plate like it was made of canvas. At 1,500 yards, still no problem. Reports from Tunisia in early 1943 described 88mm shells entering the front of a Sherman and exiting through the rear engine deck, passing completely through the tank as if it were hollow. The Sherman's designers had known this. The engineers at the Detroit Tank Arsenal, at the Chrysler Defense Arsenal, at the Grand Blanc facility run by Fisher Body, they'd all known that the Sherman's armor wouldn't stop the heaviest German anti-tank weapons. But the doctrine said it didn't need to. The doctrine said American tanks wouldn't face those weapons often enough to matter. The soldiers who died in burning Shermans from Kasserine Pass to the hedgerows of Normandy learned differently. By early 1944, the lie had become impossible to maintain. Intelligence reports filtering back from North Africa and Italy painted an increasingly grim picture. The Germans were fielding heavier tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, in greater numbers than anticipated. Worse, they were deploying 88mm anti-tank guns, not as rare specialized weapons, but as standard equipment for infantry divisions. American tank crews were encountering them constantly. The mathematics were brutal. A Sherman could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at reasonable combat ranges, but the Panzer IV could penetrate a Sherman at twice that distance. Against a Panther or Tiger, the disparity was even worse. The Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical range. The Panther could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The Tiger could do it at 3,000. American tank crews began painting their own grim calculations on the walls of bars in England that spring. 5 Shermans for 1 Tiger was the optimistic version. Some units whispered worse ratios. The tankers developed a bitter nickname for their vehicles, Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised lights every time. Shermans, the joke went, also lit every time. But there was a deeper problem, one that haunted the engineers more than the soldiers. It wasn't just that Shermans were dying. It was that they were dying before they could do their actual job. The invasion of Europe Operation Overlord, scheduled for June 6th, would require tanks to lead infantry through the Atlantic Wall, break through the hedgerows of Normandy, and assault the Siegfried Line's fortifications. Those were infantry support missions, the exact role the Sherman had been designed for. But if the tanks burned before reaching their objectives, if crews bailed out at the first sign of German armour, the entire invasion could stall. In February of 1944, a memo circulated through the Army Ground Forces. It was brief, almost bureaucratic in its language. The subject line read, "Requirement for assault tank." The text explained that the upcoming European campaign would require a heavily armoured tank capable of supporting infantry against fortified positions. The tank would need frontal armour thick enough to survive close-range anti-tank fire, particularly from 88mm guns. It would need to reach the battlefield, absorb punishment, and keep fighting. It did not say, "We need a tank that won't burn like a Ronson," but everyone who read it understood. The Ordnance Department initially proposed using the M6 heavy tank, a 37-ton beast with thick armour but dismal performance in trials. The Army Ground Forces rejected it immediately. The M6 was slow, mechanically unreliable, and already obsolete. There was also the T-26 heavy tank program, which would eventually produce the Pershing, but that wouldn't be ready until 1945 at the earliest. The assault tank was needed now, in time for D-Day. On March 2nd, an Ordnance Technical Committee meeting produced a different recommendation. Instead of developing a new tank from scratch, they would modify an existing design. They would take a standard M4A3 Sherman, the variant with the reliable Ford GAA V8 engine, and add enough armour to stop an 88mm shell. The proposal was simultaneously brilliant and desperate. Brilliant because it would use existing production capacity and supply chains. Desperate because no one was entirely sure it could be done. The basic M4A3 weighed 34 tons fully loaded. The proposed assault tank would need to weigh over 42 tons to carry the necessary armour. That meant adding 8 tons of steel plate to a chassis and suspension system never designed to carry it. The vertical volute spring suspension, the VVSS that gave the Sherman its characteristic rough ride, would be pushed beyond its design limits. The transmission, the final drives, the track system, all would be strained past, applying their intended parameters. But there was no alternative. On March 23, 1944, the Ordnance Technical Committee formally recommended limited procurement of 250 assault tanks, designated M4A3E2, plus 4 pilot vehicles for testing. The E stood for experimental, though everyone understood these weren't experiments. They were urgently needed combat vehicles being rushed into production under the convenient fiction of experimental status. The contract went to the Fisher Body Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, a massive facility south of Flint that had been building Shermans since January of 1942. Fisher Body was a division of General Motors, and before the war, they'd specialized in manufacturing car bodies, the elegant curves of Cadillacs and Buicks. Now they built tanks on assembly lines designed using principles perfected in Detroit's automotive plants. The engineering challenge was deceptively simple. Take a standard M4A3 hull, weld 38mm thick rolled armor plates to the glacis and upper hull sides, weld additional plates to the lower hull front, replace the standard differential housing with a massive cast unit almost twice as thick, design an entirely new turret with 152mm of armor on all sides, front, rear, left, right, making it one of the most heavily protected turret designs of the entire war. The result would be a Sherman with frontal armor equivalent to a Tiger I heavy tank, better than equivalent actually, because the Jumbo's armor was properly sloped, providing even greater effective thickness against incoming shells. On paper, it looked straightforward. In practice, it required solving hundreds of small problems that multiplied into larger ones. The added armor changed the tank's center of gravity. The suspension had to be reinforced. The tracks needed extended end connectors, duckbills, to distribute the increased weight and prevent the chorus tank from sinking into soft ground. The transmission gear ratios had to be modified because the engine, though powerful, was now pushing 8 more tons of mass. And there was the testing. In late March, the Ordnance Department directed the General Motors Proving Ground to conduct endurance trials with a standard M4A3 loaded with ballast weights to simulate the assault tank's anticipated for 82,600-pound combat weight. The test tank, a Ford-built M4A3 fitted with extended end connectors to reduce ground pressure, was photographed on January 18th before commencing a 500-mile endurance course over varied terrain. The engineers watched nervously. If the suspension failed, if the transmission seized, if the final drives broke under the strain, the entire program would collapse. There wasn't time to redesign the chassis. The invasion was less than 3 months away. The tank ran for 500 miles. The suspension groaned. The springs compressed, nearly flat. The crew reported that hitting bumps at speed was like being inside a steel drum beaten with hammers. But nothing catastrophic failed. The final report concluded, no abnormal failures were encountered. It therefore appears feasible to convert a medium tank into an assault tank with a weight of 82,600 pounds if only limited operation is to be encountered. That phrase, if only limited operation is to be encountered, was the engineering equivalent of a prayer. The M4A3E2 would need to survive long enough to complete its assault missions. After that, if the suspension wore out, if the transmission needed replacement, if the tracks had to be changed every few hundred miles, that was acceptable. The tank wasn't designed for sustained campaigning. It was designed to get American infantry through German defenses without burning. In April, Fisher Body began retooling their production lines, in a move that demonstrated both the urgency and the pickings. Desperation of the situation, the government waived normal testing and inspection requirements. A memo sent to Fisher in late March stated that, in order to expedite delivery of the M4, a 3E2 assault tanks, certain requirements of applicable specifications will be waived for the total of 254 vehicles. Translation: build them as fast as you can, and we'll trust you got it right. The first M4A3E2 rolled off the line in May. By July, all 254 had been completed, produced in just over 2 months, at a rate that would have seemed impossible before the war. Each tank weighed 42 tons. Each carried a crew of 5. Each bore the weight of a promise that this time American armor would hold. On June 8th, serial number 50326, one of the pilot vehicles was shipped to the Chrysler Tank Arsenal Proving Ground in Detroit for endurance trials. The tank, loaded with weights on each side to simulate a fully crewed and equipped vehicle, was driven over obstacle courses designed to replicate battlefield conditions. The suspension held. After the Detroit tests, serial number 50326 was sent to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland for ballistic testing. Aberdeen was where the real answer would come, not from calculations or metallurgical analysis, but from actual shells striking actual armor. The testing crews set up targets at varying ranges. They loaded captured German 88mm anti-tank guns with their standard armor-piercing ammunition. They fired. The results were documented in a series of photographs dated June 26, 1944, showing M4A3E2 Tom, serial number 50360 on Aberdeen's test course, its armor pockmarked by shell strikes. The official reports were classified, but the evidence was visible. The armor held. At combat ranges, the Jumbo could survive hits that would have destroyed a standard Sherman instantly. But there was something the test reports couldn't capture, something that wouldn't become clear until the tanks reached Europe and met the enemy. The tests at Aberdeen used stationary targets, careful measurements, controlled conditions. Combat was different. Combat was an immobilized tank sitting in the mud near Fronhoven, while a German crew fired 8 times in growing frustration. Combat was the difference between what armor could theoretically stop and what it actually stopped when the shells came from unexpected angles in bad weather, with desperate men on both sides. The M4A3E2S began arriving at the New York port of embarkation in mid-August. By September 8th, 208 had been shipped to Europe. The initial batches arrived at Cherbourg around September 22nd, offloaded from transport ships onto the docks of a port that had been fought over just 3 months earlier. On October 14th, the US First Army received the first 36 tanks. 15 went to the 743rd Tank Battalion, 15 to the 745th, 6 to the 746th. The tankers who received them were skeptical at first. The Jumbo looked heavier, slower, less maneuverable. The crews called it exactly that, the Jumbo, because it looked like a Sherman that had been hitting the weight room. Then they went into combat. The 743rd Tank Battalion, supporting the 30th Infantry Division, received their Jumbos in early November during the push toward the Ruhr River. The battalion was already blooded from Normandy, where they'd landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, losing half their DD tanks in the surf. They knew what German anti-tank guns could do. When the first Jumbo took an 88mm hit and the crew walked away, it changed something fundamental. It wasn't just that the tank survived, it was that the crew stopped flinching. Tankers who'd spent months calculating which path offered the least exposure, who'd learned to bail out at the first explosion, suddenly found themselves leading advances instead of following them. Near Alsdorf, Germany, on November 27th, a photographer captured a Jumbo from the 743rd moving through rubble. Sandbags covered the glacis, held in place by wire mesh and camouflage netting. The crew had added extra protection even though the armor was already proof against the weapon they feared most. Old habits died hard, but they were advancing. That was the critical thing. The tank was moving forward, toward the enemy, instead of burning. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from Wehrmacht units facing American armor in November and December of 1944 contain puzzled references to new heavy Sherman tanks that standard anti-tank weapons couldn't penetrate. Some reports mistakenly identified them as a new American heavy tank model. Others noted correctly that they appeared to be modified Shermans, but couldn't understand how the Americans had added so much armor without completely redesigning the vehicle. What the Germans were witnessing was the answer to a question the title of "This Story Poses but Doesn't Quite Capture." There was no single suicidal pressure test that made Sherman armor stop 88mm shells. Standard Shermans never could stop them, and that was always known. What happened instead was more complex and more human. American engineers, facing the reality that their doctrine had been wrong and their soldiers were dying, built a tank that could survive. They did it quickly, pragmatically, by welding more armor onto an existing design until the numbers worked. The M4A3E2 wasn't elegant. It was heavy, slow, hard on its suspension, expensive to maintain. It represented the triumph of necessity over theory, of practical engineering over doctrinal purity, and for the men who crewed them, it represented something simpler, a chance. The chance that when an 88mm shell came screaming across 800 yards of frozen German farmland, you might survive the hit, you might keep fighting, you might make it home. That was the promise, and unlike the doctrine that preceded it, this one held. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell softly through the pine trees, muffling sound, turning the world into shades of grey and white. American units stretched thin across the line had settled into what they thought would be a quiet sector. A place to rest, refit, absorb replacements. The kind of quiet that made men careless. At 5:30 in the morning, the forest erupted. Over 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous thunder that shook snow from branches and sent wildlife fleeing in terror. Then came the tanks, hundreds of them, panthers, tigers, king tigers, followed by thousands of infantry pushing west through the snow. Hitler had gambled everything on one last offensive. The goal was Antwerp, the vital port through which most Allied supplies flowed into Europe. If the Germans could split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, they might force a negotiated peace. It was desperate, probably impossible, but Germany was beyond rational calculation now. The 743rd Tank Battalion, still recovering from the brutal fighting along the Siegfried Line, found themselves pulled into the maelstrom. On December 18th, they withdrew into Belgium near Malmedy, reorienting to face an enemy they'd thought was finished. Their opponent was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the elite of the elite, equipped with the newest German armour and staffed by fanatics who believed this was their last chance to change the war's outcome. The fighting around Malmedy, Stavelot, La Glaise, and Stoumont became some of the most confused and desperate combat of the entire war. Units became separated in the snow, roads clogged with vehicles trying to move in opposite directions. Radio communication broke down. Tank commanders fought battles they couldn't see the edges, of engaging enemies that appeared from tree lines and vanished into the white, and the jumbos kept fighting. One engagement, never officially documented but recorded in the memories of survivors, involved a single M4A3E2 from the 743rd, holding a crossroads near Stoumont for 6 hours. The position was critical. Losing it would have opened a direct route for German armour into the American rear. The jumbo took 11 hits from various German anti-tank weapons. Panzerfausts struck its sides, blasting away the sandbags and scarring the armour but not penetrating. Long-range fire from a Panther, probably a 75mm gun, but possibly an 88 hit the turret front 3 times. All 3 rounds ricocheted. The tank finally withdrew when it ran out of ammunition, having fired every 75mm round and every coaxial machine gun belt it carried. The crew reported to their company commander that the tank was still operational, just empty. They refueled, rearmed, and went back into the line. That became the pattern. The jumbos weren't invulnerable. Mines could immobilize them. Close-range hits could find weak points. Mechanical failures could disable them. But they were survivable in ways standard Shermans weren't. Crews developed an almost superstitious confidence in their armour. They took risks that would have been suicidal in a regular Sherman. They led attacks instead of supporting them. They drew fire deliberately, knowing they could probably absorb it, letting lighter tanks manoeuvre while German gunners wasted ammunition on their frontal armour. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armoured Division, received their jumbos just in time for the relief of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division and attachments had been surrounded in Bastogne since December 20th, cut off, low, on ammunition, running out of medical supplies. The weather had been too poor for airdrops. The situation was desperate. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armoured Division broke through the German encirclement. Leading the column was M4A3E2, serial number 3083084. The crew had painted a name on the gun barrel: Cobra King. Cobra King reached Bastogne's perimeter first, smashing through a roadblock and linking up with the defenders around 4:45 in the afternoon. The moment was photographed, filmed, turned into propaganda, but what the cameras didn't capture was the journey getting there. Cobra King had been hit multiple times on the approach, including at least 2 strikes from German anti-tank guns that would have destroyed a standard Sherman. The armour held. The crew kept driving. The tank would survive the war and decades later be restored, eventually ending up in a museum in Brussels, its name still visible on the barrel, a monument to the breakthrough at Bastogne. But Cobra King was just one tank, one story among hundreds. By late January of 1945, when the Ardennes offensive finally collapsed and Allied forces resumed their eastward push, the US First Army had lost 22 jumbos, the Third Army had lost 8, the Ninth Army had lost 6, 36 tanks destroyed out of the roughly 250 that reached Europe. Those numbers require context. Standard Sherman losses during the same period were catastrophic: hundreds destroyed, many irreparably. The jumbo loss rate was significantly lower, not because they were held in reserve or used cautiously, but because they were thrown into the worst fighting and survived what killed other tanks. A report compiled after the Ardennes battle analysed jumbo performance in detail. The conclusions were striking. When a jumbo was lost, it was almost never because the frontal armour failed. Losses came from mines, from close-range flank shots, from mechanical breakdowns in air race, the brutal cold. From ammunition fires started by hits that penetrated the turret ring or other weak points. But frontal hits from 88mm guns, the weapon that had terrorized American tank crews for 2 years, failed to penetrate jumbo armor at combat ranges. The Fronhoven incidents, documented in photographs and after-action reports from the 743rd Tank Battalion, provided the most dramatic evidence. The first jumbo, knocked out in late November near the village, took 4 88mm hits from about 800 yards. 1 round bounced off the glacis plate, 2 bounced off the mantlet. The 4th, and this was crucial, didn't penetrate through the armour. It entered through the telescope aperture, a tiny weak point in the otherwise impregnable mantlet. Even then, it was less a failure of the armour than a demonstration that no protection is perfect. Aim small enough, hit precisely enough, and every tank has vulnerabilities. The second Fronhoven incident was even more remarkable. An M4A3E2 struck a mine, immobilizing it. The crew bailed out correctly, following doctrine. The Germans, wanting to prevent the tank's recovery, proceeded to fire 8 88mm rounds at the stationary target from 800 yards. 8 shots at a non-moving target at what amounted to medium range for an 88, 7 failed to penetrate. The 8th found the right sponson a side shot, not frontal, and ignited the fuel and ammunition. Photographs taken after the engagement show the tank's glacis plate pockmarked with impact craters, the mantlet scarred by shell strikes, but the basic armour integrity maintained. One photo shows an 88mm hit on the glacis that obliterated sandbags but barely dented the armour beneath. The sandbags, which crews had added because they didn't quite trust even the jumbo's protection, had been completely unnecessary. The armour would have stopped the round regardless. German. After-action reports from units that engaged jumbos reveal a progression from confusion to frustration to something approaching fear. Early reports from November describe heavy Sherman variants as a new threat requiring different tactics. By December, reports specifically warn against engaging these tanks frontally, recommending flanking maneuvers or withdrawal if flanking wasn't possible. By January, some reports simply note that standard anti-tank guns are ineffective against the new American armour. This was a remarkable reversal. For 2 years, German gunners had enjoyed devastating superiority against American tanks. 88mm guns could engage Shermans at ranges where the Sherman's gun couldn't effectively respond. Now, suddenly, there were American tanks that negated that advantage. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. When your primary anti-tank weapon stops working, when you watch rounds bounce off targets that should be easy kills, it changes how you fight. But here's what makes the story complex. What prevents it from being simple triumph? There were only 254 jumbos. That's it. Less than 1% of total Sherman production. Less than 1% of the Shermans fighting in Europe. The vast majority of American tank crews still drove standard M4S and M4A3S with armor that couldn't stop 88mm fire. They still faced Panthers and Tigers and entrenched anti-tank guns with the same disadvantages they'd always had. The jumbo didn't solve the broader problem of American tank design. It was a band-aid, an emergency response to a specific need infantry support against fortified positions that happened to also provide the armor protection tankers had been begging for since Kasserine Pass. In early 1945, with the end of the war approaching, there were requests for more jumbos. The new version was to use the 76mm gun instead of the 75, providing both armor protection and better anti-tank capability. Some proposals suggested mounting the 90mm gun from the M26 Pershing on a jumbo chassis, creating a tank that could engage Tigers and Panthers on equal terms while still supporting infantry. None of it happened. By the time the requests reached production planning stages, the war was nearly over. The M26 Pershing was finally reaching Europe in meaningful numbers, providing the heavy tank capability the Army had needed since 1943. The urgency that had driven the jumbo program disappeared as German resistance collapsed. The last jumbos were lost in April and May of 1945 during the final push into Germany. Some were knocked out by late-model German tanks. Some broke down from accumulated wear on suspensions that had never been designed for 42-ton vehicles. Some were simply abandoned when they could no longer keep up with the advancing American armies. Their suspensions failed, their transmissions seized, victims of the weight they'd been asked to carry. But they'd done their job. Every jumbo that survived an 88mm hit, every crew that walked away from what should have been a fatal engagement, every infantry squad that advanced behind armor thick enough to absorb enemy fire, those were the victories that mattered. Not in grand strategic terms, but in the smaller, more human calculation of men coming home. So what's the real answer to the question posed by this story's title? How did one engineer's suicidal pressure test make Sherman armor stop 88mm shells? The truth is more complicated and more interesting than the title suggests. There was no single engineer, no dramatic personal test like John Garand firing an overloaded proof round to validate his rifle design. The M4A3E2 program was a committee effort, a bureaucratic response to operational necessity, involving dozens of engineers at the Ordnance Department, at Fisher Body, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, at the testing facilities in Detroit and Maryland. What they did wasn't revolutionary. They didn't invent new metallurgy or discover exotic armor compounds. They simply added more steel. They welded 38mm plates onto existing armor until the numbers worked. They designed a turret with walls thick enough to stop anything Germany could practically field. They tested it methodically, sent it to war, and watched it perform. The testing wasn't suicidal because it didn't need to be. The engineers knew the armor would work because the mathematics of penetration were well understood. An 88mm armor-piercing round could penetrate approximately 140mm of vertical armor at 500 yards. The jumbo's glacis plate, sloped at 47 degrees, presented an effective thickness of 149mm. The mantlet was 180mm thick. The math said it would hold, and the math was right. But calling it just mathematics misses something essential. The decision to build the jumbo represented an admission that American tank doctrine had been fundamentally wrong. It acknowledged that medium tanks would face other tanks regularly, that armor protection mattered more than the theorists had believed. that soldiers' lives were worth the cost and complexity of heavier vehicles. That admission came late. 2 years into the war, after thousands of tankers had died in under-armoured vehicles, after Kasserine Pass and Normandy and the Siegfried Line had proven what combat was actually like. The Jumbo was an apology written in welded steel, a promise that someone had finally listened. The Jumbos that survived the war had varied fates. Some were shipped back to the United States for study and eventual scrapping. Some remained in Europe, sold or given to Allied nations rebuilding their armies. A few ended up as monuments, their armour still bearing scars of combat. Cobra King, the famous Bastogne relief tank, was restored in the 2000s after being identified and rescued from a training range where it had been used for target practice for decades. The restoration team found shell impacts on the armour evidence of hits taken during the war and preserved them as part of the tank's story. The lessons learned from the Jumbo program influenced post-war American tank design, but not in the ways you might expect. The Army didn't build more assault tanks. Instead, they focused on developing tanks that balanced firepower, armour, and mobility more effectively than the Sherman had. The M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, eventually the M48 and M60, each incorporated better armour protection as a baseline assumption, not an emergency modification. The German engineers who tested captured Shermans at Kummersdorf Proving Ground, who documented American automotive superiority with clinical precision, never tested a Jumbo. None were captured intact early enough in the war for comprehensive testing. But German tactical reports from late 1944 and early 1945 make it clear they recognized what they were facing. American armor had evolved. The easy kills were becoming harder to find. For the soldiers who crewed Jumbos, the experience remained visceral decades after the war. Veterans' accounts describe the sound of rounds bouncing off the armor, a metallic clang followed by the Doppler shift of the deflected shell, screaming away into the distance. They describe the feeling of invincibility, tempered by the knowledge that mines and close-range hits could still kill them. They describe leading advances they never would have attempted in a standard Sherman, drawing fire to protect lighter tanks, accepting risks because the armor gave them options. One veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, described it simply, "In a regular Sherman, you were always calculating. Where's the nearest? Cover. Can I get there before they fire? Is this road exposed?" With a Jumbo, you stopped calculating and started fighting. That's all we wanted, a chance to fight instead of just die. That chance came at a cost. The M4A3E2 was never going to be a perfect tank. It was too heavy for its suspension, too slow for exploitation operations, too specialized for general use. Its 75mm gun, chosen for infantry support rather than anti-tank work, left it vulnerable in tank versus tank combat against heavy German armor. The crews learned to avoid engaging Panthers and Tigers frontally, using their armor to survive until they could maneuver for flank shots or withdraw to let tank destroyers handle the threat. But perfection wasn't the goal. Survival was the goal. Getting American infantry through German defenses was the goal. And in those specific, limited objectives, the Jumbo succeeded brilliantly. The final irony is that the tank America needed most desperately in 1943 wasn't built until 1944, and by then, the war's outcome was already decided. The Jumbos arrived too late to change the strategic picture, too few in number to affect loss rates significantly, too specialized to become the standard. They were a footnote to the larger Sherman story, and might have been rendered in 254 examples. But to the men who crewed them, to the infantry who advanced behind them, to the families who got sons and husbands and fathers back because a tank's armor held when it should have failed to them, the Jumbo was everything. In Fronhoven, that burned-out M4A3E2 sat in the mud through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. German and American forces traded control of the area multiple times. Engineers eventually recovered the hull for salvage, cutting it apart to study the shell impacts, to understand exactly how the armor had performed. They found 7 impact craters on the 10 frontal armor, 7 hits from 88mm guns that had failed to penetrate. The engineers took measurements, wrote reports, filed them away. The technical data would inform future designs, contribute to the slow accumulation of knowledge that eventually produced better tanks. But standing in that frozen field, looking at a burned tank that had absorbed 7 killing shots and failed only on the 8th, the engineers must have understood something the reports couldn't capture. This tank, this emergency modification, rushed into production to solve an urgent problem, had kept its promise. It had given its crew a chance. In the calculus of war, where chance is the rarest commodity, that was everything. The title of this story asks how a suicidal pressure test made Sherman armor stop 88mm shells. The answer is, it didn't. Not like that. Not in one dramatic moment. What happened instead was slower, more bureaucratic, more human. Engineers acknowledged a mistake. Factories retooled production lines. Metallurgists calculated thickness requirements. Welders joined plates. Drivers learned to handle heavier vehicles. Gunners learned to trust their armor. And somewhere in that process, spread across months and thousands of people, America built a tank that could stop the unstoppable. Not all of them, not even most of them, just 254, just enough to prove it could be done, just enough to save some of the men who climbed inside. In the end, that had to be enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.